The guns fell silent, the flags were lowered, the leaders were tried or buried. History books draw a clean line and move on. But that belief is one of the greatest illusions of the modern world, because the truth is far more unsettling. World War II never truly ended. It simply changed shape. The battlefields disappeared, but the secrets remained, and those secrets are still shaping global politics today in ways most people never see. If you live in a world divided by nuclear fear, intelligence agencies, proxy wars, frozen conflicts, propaganda, and silent power struggles, then you are living inside the aftermath of World War II. The borders you recognize, the alliances you trust, the enemies you're told to fear, all of them were born not in victory parades, but in locked rooms, whispered agreements, stolen documents, and moral compromises made when the world was exhausted and desperate. And the most disturbing part is this: many of those decisions were never meant to be temporary. When the war ended in 1945, humanity stood at a crossroads unlike anything before it. 60 million people were dead. Entire cities were erased. Empires collapsed overnight. The world was traumatized, broken, and terrified of repeating the same catastrophe. But instead of rebuilding on truth and accountability, the great powers chose something else: control through secrecy. They buried evidence. They protected criminals. They rewrote narratives. And they quietly laid the foundations for a new kind of conflict, one fought not with tanks and bombers, but with intelligence files, covert operations, economic pressure, and psychological warfare. The first and most dangerous secret of World War II was this: victory did not mean justice. In public, the world watched the Nuremberg trials and believed that accountability had been served. Nazi leaders stood in court. Crimes were documented. Sentences were delivered. It felt like closure. But behind the scenes, a different reality was unfolding. Intelligence agencies from the United States, the Soviet Union, and even former enemies were racing to secure something far more valuable than justice: information. Scientists, engineers, spies, code breakers, and weapons experts were quietly removed from prison lists and execution orders. Their pasts were erased. Their crimes were ignored. Their knowledge was too useful to waste. This was the birth of a moral fracture that still defines global politics today. The moment when the world decided that some truths were too inconvenient to reveal and some criminals too valuable to punish. One of the clearest examples came almost immediately after the war. As Europe lay in ruins, the United States launched a secret operation that most people never learn about in school: Operation Paperclip. On paper, it was a scientific recruitment program. In reality, it was a desperate scramble to capture German technology before the Soviets could. Hundreds of former Nazi scientists were secretly brought to America. Their records were cleaned, their SS affiliations erased, their experiments forgotten. Men who had worked inside Hitler's war machine were given new lives, new names, and new careers inside the very country that had fought them. The most famous of these men would later help put humans on the moon. But buried beneath that triumph is a question that still haunts international politics today. What happens when power is built on silence instead of accountability? The Soviet Union was doing the same thing. Entire German research facilities were dismantled and shipped east. Scientists were relocated under guard. Families were separated. Knowledge became a weapon. And from that moment forward, global politics stopped being about who had won the war and became about who controlled the secrets of it. This is where the Cold War truly began, not with speeches or borders, but with stolen minds. At the same time, intelligence agencies underwent a transformation that permanently altered how nations interact. During the war, espionage had been a tool of survival. After the war, it became a permanent institution. The OSS evolved into the CIA. The NKVD evolved into the KGB. Britain refined MI6 into a global intelligence network. These organizations were no longer temporary wartime necessities. They became the invisible nervous systems of modern states. And once secrecy becomes permanent, truth becomes optional. The alliances formed during World War II were never as solid as they appeared. The United States and the Soviet Union had fought the same enemy, but they did not trust each other, and with good reason. Each side knew the other was hiding something. Each side knew the other was manipulating the post-war world in quiet, irreversible ways. Europe was divided not by ideology alone, but by secret agreements made while the war was still raging. At Yalta and Potsdam, leaders spoke publicly about peace and cooperation, while privately carving the world into spheres of influence that millions would never consent to. Eastern Europe did not fall under Soviet control by accident. It was absorbed through a mixture of military presence, political manipulation, and intelligence-backed regime changes. Governments were infiltrated, opposition figures disappeared, elections were staged, and all of it was justified as a necessary continuation of wartime security. This logic, that extreme measures are acceptable in the name of preventing another catastrophe, became one of the most enduring legacies of World War II. You can still hear it echoed today. Every time a government justifies surveillance, secrecy, or covert intervention by invoking national security, it is drawing directly from a post-1945 playbook. A playbook written when the world was afraid, traumatized, and willing to accept almost anything to avoid another global war. But perhaps the most explosive secret of all was unleashed in the final days of the conflict: the atomic bomb. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just military actions, they were messages not only to Japan, but to the entire world. The war ended, but a new reality began, one where absolute destruction could be delivered in a single moment. Nuclear weapons transformed diplomacy into a psychological standoff. Power was no longer measured only in armies or territory, but in the ability to annihilate civilization itself. And here is the secret few people confront honestly. Nuclear deterrence is built on the assumption that someone, somewhere, is always lying. During the Cold War, both sides exaggerated their capabilities, hid their weaknesses, and conducted secret tests that violated treaties. False alarms nearly triggered global annihilation more than once. Decisions that could have ended humanity were made by individuals under pressure, often based on incomplete or manipulated information. And all of this traced back to the unresolved trauma and secrecy of World War II. Even today, nuclear politics are shaped by those early decisions: which countries were allowed to develop nuclear weapons, which were forbidden, which were secretly assisted, which were punished. The global nuclear order was never fair, transparent, or moral. It was inherited. And inheritance matters. Look at modern flashpoints: Ukraine, Taiwan, the Korean Peninsula, the Middle East. Each of these regions is entangled in unresolved World War II outcomes, borders drawn hastily, promises made quietly, historical grievances left deliberately ambiguous, intelligence operations that never stopped, only adapted. Russia's sense of encirclement, China's emphasis on historical humiliation, Japan's constitutional pacifism and its quiet remilitarization, Germany's restraint and economic dominance, America's role as global enforcer. None of these emerged by accident. They are echoes of decisions made when the world was trying to survive the rubble of 1945. And the most dangerous part is this: most people don't know they are living inside these echoes. They consume headlines without realizing the roots. They debate politics without seeing the buried history. They argue about present-day conflicts without understanding that many of them were engineered decades ago by people who believed secrecy was safer than truth. World War II taught governments that control of information can be as powerful as control of armies. And once that lesson was learned, it was never forgotten. The war ended, the secrets did not. When World War II ended, armies returned home, factories slowed, and civilians tried to rebuild their lives. But behind the appearance of peace, a different war was already accelerating, one without front lines, uniforms, or surrender documents. It was a war fought in shadows, in classified files, in radio transmissions, and in human minds. And it was born directly from the lessons of World War II. The war taught governments something terrifyingly effective: you don't need to conquer territory if you can control perception. During World War II, propaganda had been crude but powerful: posters, speeches, radio broadcasts. But after 1945, propaganda evolved into something far more sophisticated. Intelligence agencies realized that shaping how people think could be more decisive than bombing cities. This realization permanently changed global politics. The United States, the Soviet Union, and their allies quietly transformed wartime intelligence units into permanent institutions with unprecedented authority. These agencies no longer existed to win a single conflict. They existed to prevent surprises, eliminate threats before they appeared, and most importantly, manage narratives. Truth became flexible, facts became tools, and public opinion became a battlefield. One of the earliest post-war secrets involved stay-behind Nutwaks clandestine armies embedded inside supposedly peaceful nations. In Western Europe, NATO countries quietly supported covert resistance groups meant to activate if the Soviets ever invaded. Weapons were hidden, safe houses prepared, civilians recruited without their neighbors knowing. In Italy, Belgium, and elsewhere, these networks sometimes interfered in domestic politics, manipulating elections and destabilizing governments deemed too left-leaning. The public was never told. In the East, the Soviet Union perfected its own system of invisible control. Intelligence officers were embedded into newly formed governments. Political loyalty was enforced through surveillance, blackmail, and fear. Opposition figures vanished into prisons or shallow grave. Entire populations learned to censor themselves. This was not an accident. It was the direct application of wartime counterintelligence techniques refined into peacetime governance. World War II had proven that fear works, and fear became policy. Perhaps the most chilling legacy of this invisible war was the normalization of false flags, deniable operations, and proxy conflicts. Instead of direct confrontation, superpowers fought through others. Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Angola, Latin America, the Middle East. Each conflict was shaped by intelligence assessments, secret funding, and covert intervention, often justified by classified information that the public would never see. The phrase national security became a magic shield. Anything could be hidden behind it. And once secrecy became routine, accountability quietly vanished. The intelligence agencies born from World War II were given extraordinary power with minimal oversight. Leaders justified this by pointing to the past. We failed to see Pearl Harbor. We underestimated Hitler. We can't afford another surprise. Those arguments worked. They still work. And they allow extraordinary actions to be taken without public consent. This dynamic reshaped democracies from the inside. Elections continued, but influence moved elsewhere. Media narratives became entangled with intelligence briefings. Leaks were selective. Scandals were buried. Sometimes governments lied not because they wanted to, but because telling the truth would expose decades of previous lies. World War II secrets didn't just shape foreign policy, they quietly hollowed out transparency at home. One of the most powerful examples of this legacy is psychological warfare. During the war, both Axis and Allied forces experimented with morale-breaking tactics, leaflets, rumors, manipulated broadcasts. After the war, those techniques were refined into psychological operations, or psyops. Entire populations became targets. Messages were tailored to exploit fears, resentments, and historical trauma. Cultural fault lines were studied like battle maps. This wasn't theory, it was science. Documents later revealed that intelligence agencies conducted experiments on human behavior, perception, and influence, sometimes without consent. The goal was simple: understand how people could be nudged, frightened, or persuaded into compliance. The war had taught leaders that mass behavior could decide outcomes. The Cold War turned that lesson into doctrine. And the most disturbing part, these techniques never stopped evolving. Modern disinformation campaigns, fake news, bot networks, manipulated social media are not new phenomena. They are digital descendants of World War II propaganda strategies. The platforms changed. The principles did not. Control attention, confuse truth, divide populations, exhaust critical thinking. The battlefield simply moved into your pocket. Another secret legacy of World War II lies in how Easterusk intelligence agencies learned to work above the law. Easterusk. During the war, emergency powers were understandable. After the war, those powers quietly became permanent. Surveillance expanded. Black sites emerged. Rendition programs moved suspects across borders without trial. Alliances formed between intelligence agencies that bypassed legal restrictions by outsourcing dirty work to partners. This created a world where responsibility could always be denied. If a covert operation failed, it was unauthorized. If civilians died, it was classified. If evidence emerged, it was buried under redactions. This culture of deniability was not accidental. It was inherited from wartime necessity and never relinquished. And over time, it reshaped international trust. Countries no longer believed official statements. Allies suspected each other. Enemies assumed deception as default. Treaties were signed publicly and undermined privately. Arms control agreements were violated in secret. This constant uncertainty created a fragile global balance, one maintained not by honesty, but by fear of escalation. The irony is painful. World War II was fought to stop tyranny, yet its aftermath normalized secrecy on a scale tyrants could only dream of. Even humanitarian efforts were affected. Intelligence agencies embedded themselves in aid organizations. Journalists were recruited as assets. Cultural exchanges doubled as intelligence-gathering operations. Nothing was purely civilian anymore. This blurred line made neutrality almost impossible and, in many regions, deadly. If you wonder why modern conflicts are so confusing, why information feels unreliable, why no side seems entirely truthful, the answer lies here. The world learned during World War II that Easterusk winning hearts and minds mattered as much as winning battles. Easterusk. And once that lesson was learned, it was never forgotten. But there is another layer to this story, one even more unsettling. Because the intelligence war didn't just target enemies, it targeted citizens. Governments that survived World War II understood something dangerous. Populations under stress will accept extraordinary control if they believe it's necessary. Fear of another global catastrophe became a justification for surveillance, censorship, and repression, even in democratic societies. The threat was always framed as external, but the methods were internal. And slowly, quietly, the world normalized it. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world believed peace would be drawn with ink. Borders would be finalized, nations reborn, conflicts resolved. But the truth is far more unsettling. The map created after World War II was never meant to heal wounds. It was designed to manage power. And those lines, drawn hastily in conference rooms by exhausted victors, are still bleeding today. The leaders who gathered at Yalta and Potsdam did not see borders as cultural realities. They saw them as strategic buffers. Poland was shifted west like a chess piece. Germany was sliced into zones. Korea was split along a line that no Korean had drawn. Vietnam, Palestine, India, Pakistan, each became laboratories of post-war compromise where stability was promised but never guaranteed. These decisions were classified, the trade-offs were hidden, and the consequences were outsourced to future generations. In Eastern Europe, entire nations awoke to find themselves trapped behind an iron curtain they never voted for. Wartime promises of freedom were quietly replaced by geopolitical necessity. Resistance fighters who had battled Nazis were labeled enemies overnight. Governments were installed not by consent, but by convenience. The Soviet Union justified this as security. The West called it containment. Ordinary people called it betrayal. The Cold War did not begin with speeches, it began with silence. In Asia, the collapse of Japanese imperial control unleashed chaos that no one had planned for. Colonial powers returned weakened. Independence movements surged. But instead of supporting self-determination, global powers filtered these revolutions through Cold War paranoia. Nationalism was acceptable. Socialism was not. Leaders were backed or overthrown not for their legitimacy, but for their alignment. This is why so many post-war conflicts feel unresolved, because they were never resolved, only postponed. The Middle East stands as one of the most haunting examples. Borders drawn by British and French officials ignored tribal realities, religious divisions, and historical rivalries. Promises made during the war, to Arabs, to Jews, to allies, contradicted one another. When the dust settled, resentment filled the gaps where clarity should have been. Every explosion today echoes a decision made behind closed doors in the 1940s. Africa followed a similar pattern. European powers exited quickly, leaving fragile states stitched together from incompatible regions. Intelligence agencies quietly influenced leadership transitions. Resources became leverage. Civil wars erupted not because nations failed, but because they were never truly allowed to form organically. World War II ended empires, but it replaced them with dependency. And then there is China. The Chinese Civil War, paused during the fight against Japan, resumed with ferocity after 1945. The outcome reshaped the entire global order. The People's Republic of China emerged not just as a nation, but as a geopolitical force forged in betrayal, sacrifice, and exclusion. Taiwan became a frozen conflict. Korea became a divided scar. Southeast Asia became a battleground for influence. The war taught superpowers that regional conflicts could be controlled remotely ***, armed, funded, inflamed, and abandoned as needed. This is where the modern doctrine of proxy war was born. From Afghanistan to Central America, from the Middle East to Africa, conflicts were no longer accidents. They were instruments. Wars could be fought without declarations. Enemies could be weakened without confrontation. Civilian suffering became collateral to strategy. And the public was told only fragments. Meanwhile, institutions created during World War II, the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, were meant to stabilize the world. But their power dynamics reflected the war's victors, not the world's populations. Vetoes replaced consensus. Aid replaced autonomy. Intervention replaced accountability. Peace became conditional. This imbalance created resentment that still fuels global distrust. Nations labeled developing were often those whose futures were decided without them. Their histories rewritten as failures rather than consequences. Their instability blamed on culture instead of manipulation. Even Europe, rebuilt through the Marshall Plan, carried hidden scars. Economic recovery came with political alignment. Neutrality became suspect. Military alliances hardened. NATO was formed not just for defense, but for deterrence through permanence. Once again, the logic of wartime emergency became permanent policy. And permanence breeds inertia. As decades passed, these post-war structures became self-defending systems. Intelligence agencies protected their secrets. Governments protected their narratives. Mistakes were reframed as necessity. Atrocities were classified. And accountability faded into archives no one was allowed to read. Then came the digital age. Suddenly, documents leaked. Voices multiplied. The internet cracked open the sealed vault of post-war secrecy. But instead of clarity, the world entered confusion. Truth competed with misinformation. Revelation collided with denial. And the institutions shaped by WWII struggled to adapt to a world where secrecy was harder, but manipulation was easier. This is why modern geopolitics feels unstable. The structures are old, the secrets are heavy, and the world has changed. Every crisis today, Ukraine, Taiwan, the Middle East, cyber warfare, intelligence leaks, exists within a framework built in the aftermath of 1945. Leaders still think in Cold War terms. Militaries still plan around nuclear shadows. Intelligence agencies still operate on assumptions forged in a world of radio transmissions and paper files. And yet the consequences are global, instant, and irreversible. The greatest secret of World War II is not a weapon or a document. It is this: the war never truly ended, it evolved ***. There is a comforting lie we tell ourselves, that history moves forward, that lessons are learned, that the worst chapters close so new ones can begin. World War II is often framed this way: a catastrophic storm humanity survived, followed by reconstruction, unity, and progress. But the truth is far more disturbing. World War II did not end, it simply went underground. The institutions, doctrines, alliances, and fears born in that war were never dismantled. They were refined, hardened, passed down quietly, generation to generation, like inherited trauma encoded into policy. The nuclear bomb was supposed to be the war-ending weapon. Instead, it became the foundation of a permanent standoff. Deterrence replaced peace. Fear replaced diplomacy. Humanity did not step back from annihilation. It learned how to live beside it. Every major power now plans not how to avoid war, but how to survive the unthinkable. This mindset, born in 1945, still governs global strategy. Intelligence agencies today operate with authorities justified by wartime emergency powers that were never fully revoked. Surveillance once meant to catch spies now tracks entire populations. Secrecy, once used to protect resistance movements, now shields corruption, manipulation, and unaccountable power. Governments justify it the same way they always have, for your safety. But safety, without transparency, breeds mistrust. The psychological legacy of World War II may be its most dangerous inheritance. Nations learn that fear works, that trauma can unify, that enemies, real or imagined, can silence dissent and accelerate control. Political leaders still invoke existential threats because they know the emotional circuitry works. The public, conditioned by decades of Cold War logic, accepts trade-offs that once would have been unthinkable. Freedom exchanged for security, truth delayed for stability, accountability postponed indefinitely. And then there is memory itself. World War II is remembered selectively, heroism emphasized, complicity blurred, atrocities acknowledged, but often detached from systems that enabled them. This selective memory shapes modern identity. Nations define themselves by what they resisted, not what they tolerated, by victories, not compromises. That selective memory becomes policy. This is why modern conflicts are so emotionally charged. They are not just territorial or political, they are historical. Each side invokes a version of the past that justifies the present. Each claims moral inheritance from a war that ended nearly a century ago. Each believes history is on their side. And history, weaponized, is powerful. The final, and perhaps most chilling secret of World War II is this: the systems built to prevent another global war may now be making one more likely ***. Old alliances strain under new realities. Nuclear deterrence becomes fragile in a multipolar world. Information warfare replaces conventional battlefields. Cyber attacks blur the line between war and peace. Artificial intelligence accelerates decisions once slowed by human doubt. The architecture of 1945 was not built for this world. And yet, we are still living inside it. You feel this tension everywhere: economic instability, political polarization, rising nationalism, collapsing trust in institutions. These are not random failures. They are stress fractures in a global order stretched beyond its design. The world has changed faster than the systems meant to govern it. World War II taught humanity how to mobilize everything: industry, science, psychology, narrative, for survival. That knowledge never vanished. It waits in databases, doctrines, and emergency playbooks. Every time a crisis erupts, leaders reach instinctively for those tools. The danger is not that history repeats itself. The danger is that it never stopped ***. So what does this mean for us? It means the future is not predetermined, but it is constrained by decisions we did not make. It means understanding World War II is not about honoring the past. It is about recognizing the invisible scaffolding holding up the present. It means asking harder questions about secrecy, power, and whose safety truly matters. And it means recognizing that awareness itself is an act of resistance. Because once you see how deeply the war's secrets still shape our world, you cannot unsee them. You begin to notice patterns, justifications, silences. You understand that peace is not merely the absence of war, but the presence of accountability. World War II ended in 1945. But its shadow still votes, still budgets, still spies, still threatens. And whether the next global chapter is written in reform or repetition depends on how honestly we confront the one we inherited. If this story changed how you see the world, even slightly, then it has done its job. Because history doesn't just belong to the past. It belongs to whoever understands it next. Thanks for watching.